It's 6 a.m., Tuesday. I'm sipping my black coffee, keys in hand, about to back my truck out for work, when I open the garage door and freeze. My entire driveway is gone, buried under a fresh, steaming pile of 3 tons of crushed limestone gravel, dumped silently at 2 a.m. while we slept. My truck's trapped, my wife's late for her ER shift, my 8-year-old son's already missing the school bus. We're literally imprisoned in our own home. And right there at the end of the cul-de-sac stands the HOA president, arms crossed, that smirk on her face like she just checkmated me. She thought she'd won. She had no idea she'd just handed me the perfect grenade and pulled the pin herself. Stick around, because what happened in the next 48 hours still makes her wake up in a cold sweat. Drop a comment right now. What's the most unhinged thing your HOA has ever pulled? Let me take you back about 8 months before the gravel incident, because you need to understand what kind of neighborhood Sycamore Ridge actually was, and what kind of man Garrett Howell was before all of this turned him into something of a local legend. Garrett was 53 years old, a former heavy equipment operator who'd spent 22 years running cranes and bulldozers for a regional construction outfit before a back injury sidelined him. He wasn't bitter about it. He retrained as a licensed home inspector, built a solid client base, drove a 2014 F-250, and paid cash for a 3-bedroom colonial on Fenwick Court in a mid-sized suburb of central Ohio. His wife, Dolores, worked part-time dispatch for a plumbing company. His daughter, Tess, was 16 and had a 4.1 GPA and a soccer scholarship on her radar. Normal family, good people, the kind of neighbors who shoveled the walk of the older couple next door without being asked. The smell of the neighborhood in early autumn was honestly pleasant. Somebody always had a fire pit going. The oak trees dropped that sharp, earthy smell of wet leaves, and half the houses had mums on the front steps in orange and burgundy. Garrett liked where he lived. Past tense. The trouble had a name, Ranata Foss. Ranata was 61, recently retired from a regional bank where she'd spent decades as a mid-level loan officer, which is to say, she'd spent her whole career wielding small amounts of power over people who needed something from her. When she retired, she apparently couldn't let go of the feeling, because within 18 months, she had run for, won, and fully weaponized the presidency of the Sycamore Ridge Homeowners Association. The HOA board had 3 seats. Ranata had installed her neighbor Clive and her tennis partner Wanda in the other 2. It was a junta in khaki pants. Garrett's problems with Ranata started the way these things always do. Petty, almost laughable. In June, he'd gotten a violation notice for his basketball hoop. It was 6 inches too close to the property line, according to Ranata's measuring tape. He moved it. In July, a second notice. His trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. He started rolling them in faster. August brought a notice about the color of his mailbox post. Apparently, the association guidelines specified colonial white, and Garrett's post was antique ivory. These are not the same color, Ranata informed him in a letter with 3 different fonts, as if she'd gotten angry halfway through typing it. Garrett had laughed at that one, showed it to Dolores. She didn't laugh as hard. Because here's the thing that Garrett didn't fully appreciate yet. Ranata wasn't just annoying, she was strategic. Every violation notice she sent was meticulously dated, photographed, and filed. She was building a paper trail, and Garrett, a guy who fixed things with his hands and settled disputes with a handshake, hadn't started building anything at all. The first really unfair act came in September. Garrett had applied for a permit to add a small detached workshop in his backyard. Fully within county zoning codes, pre-approved by the county planning office, all the paperwork clean. Under the Sycamore Ridge HOA bylaws, architectural modifications required board approval. Garrett submitted his application. Ranata denied it in 4 days, citing aesthetic inconsistency with neighborhood character. No hearing, no appeal offered. Just a form letter with her signature in red ink, like she was a teacher failing a student she'd already decided she didn't like. That workshop was going to be Garrett's physical therapy. Somewhere to work with his hands, stay active, stay sane. Having it denied felt like a door slamming in his face. He called the county. He called a lawyer friend. He started reading the HOA bylaws. And that's when Garrett Howell stopped being a passive resident and started paying very close attention. The first real escalation happened because Garrett made the mistake of being right out loud. After his workshop application was denied, he dug into the bylaws, and we're talking dug in, the way a man with construction experience and too much time on his bad back days will dig into a document. He printed the thing out, all 47 pages, spread it across the kitchen table, and went through it with a yellow highlighter and a red pen. Dolores brought him coffee and asked if he was doing his taxes. He said it felt about the same. What he found was simple. The architectural review process required a written decision within 30 days of submission, and that decision had to cite a specific bylaw provision. Ranata's denial letter had cited aesthetic inconsistency, which was not, anywhere in 47 pages, an actual provision. It was something she'd made up, dressed in bureaucratic language, and stamped with her name in red ink. Garrett wrote her a letter. Polite, calm, 3 paragraphs. He pointed out the specific procedural requirement, noted that her denial was non-compliant, and requested either a proper decision citing a real provision or automatic approval per the bylaw's default clause, which stated that any non-compliant decision would be treated as an abstention, and a second abstention triggered automatic approval. He hand-delivered it, put it in her mailbox on a Wednesday morning. The air had that sharp October bite, leaves skittering across the asphalt, and he could hear his own footsteps on the gravel edging of her walkway. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Each step feeling a little bit like punctuation. Ranata's response came in 5 days, not the proper review he'd requested. Instead, a new violation notice. His F250, parked in his own driveway, was in violation of the HOA's commercial vehicle restriction, a buried clause in the bylaws that prohibited vehicles primarily used for commercial purposes from being parked in view of the street for more than 4 hours at a time. Was Garrett's truck used commercially? He drove it to job sites, yes. Was it primarily a commercial vehicle? It was a personal truck he also happened to use for work. But Ranata had checked his business registration, found he was a licensed home inspector, and decided, with no due process whatsoever, that the F250 was a commercial vehicle. The fine was $150 per day. Garrett took a breath. Then he called his lawyer friend, a guy named Terrence who did mostly real estate closings, but knew his HOA law cold. Terrence told him the commercial vehicle restriction was almost certainly unenforceable as written, because it used subjective language and lacked a definition of primarily commercial. He also told Garrett something more important. HOAs in Ohio are governed under the Ohio Planned Community Act, and any fines imposed without proper notice and a hearing opportunity were not legally collectible. Takeaway: in most states, HOA fines are only enforceable if the association followed its own procedural rules exactly, and most don't. Garrett sent a certified letter, return receipt requested, the little green card they sign, informing Ranata that he was formally invoking his right to a hearing before any fine was assessed, as required under Ohio Revised Code 5312.12. He also noted that if the fine was placed as a lien on his property without the required hearing, he would pursue damages under the Ohio Consumer Sales Practices Act, which allowed for treble damages and attorney's fees. He'd learned that last part from Terrence, who had said it with the flat smile of a man who genuinely enjoyed watching unreasonable people realize they'd miscalculated. Ranata did not respond directly. What she did instead was send Clive, her board co-conspirator, a reedy man in his late 50s who always looked like he was about to ask to speak with someone's manager, to, informally, tell Garrett that the board had the community's best interests at heart, and that Garrett might want to reconsider his adversarial approach. Garrett told Clive, very politely, that he'd reconsider his approach when the board reconsidered its bylaws. Clive left. The fine notice disappeared, never formally assessed. Garrett's truck stayed in his driveway. Round 1 to Garrett. But Ranata Foss was not the kind of person who absorbed a loss and recalibrated. She was the kind of person who absorbed a loss and escalated. The board's next meeting had a new agenda item, a proposed amendment to the architectural review process, granting the president emergency authority to deny any modification application without the standard procedural requirements for up to 60 days, if the president determined an urgent aesthetic risk existed. The amendment passed 2-1. Clive and Ranata voted yes. The third board member, a quiet retired teacher named Orrin, who rarely said anything, voted no and looked vaguely nauseated. Garrett found out about it in the meeting minutes, posted to the HOA website a week later. He read the amendment twice, jaw tight. Then he printed it out and added it to what was becoming a fairly thick folder. He was starting to understand. This wasn't about his truck, or his mailbox, or his workshop. This was about whether Garrett Howell was the kind of man who could be made to feel small in his own home. He was not. November arrived gray and cold, and with it, Ranata's next move, which was less a chess piece and more a brick through a window. Garrett came home from a home inspection job on a Thursday afternoon to find an orange placard taped to his front door. Not a violation notice this time. A formal notice of intent to lien, claiming $1,350 in accumulated HOA dues and fees. Problem: Garrett was current on his dues. He had bank records proving automatic payments going back 3 years without a single missed month. The $1,350 figure was the commercial vehicle fines, the ones he'd formally contested and the board had never properly assessed at a hearing. They'd skipped the hearing and gone straight to a lien notice anyway. The visceral wrongness of seeing a lien notice on his own front door, that fluorescent orange against the white paint, his daughter pulling into the driveway in her hand-me-down Civic and asking, "Dad, what's that?" landed somewhere deep. Not panic, something colder. The particular kind of quiet anger that settles in when you realize someone isn't just being difficult, they're trying to hurt you. Dolores was furious in the efficient, terrifying way she had. She didn't raise her voice, she just got very precise. "Call Terrence," she said. "Tonight." Terrence's response, when Garrett sent him photos of the notice, came back in under an hour. "This is textbook wrongful lien. Call me first thing tomorrow. We're going to have some fun." What Terrence explained the next morning was that placing a lien on a property to collect HOA fines that had not been adjudicated through the required hearing process wasn't just an HOA violation. It was potentially a violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act if the HOA was using a management company or attorney in the process. A quick check of the notice showed it had been generated by a property management firm called Crestline Community Services, which Ranata had hired 8 months ago using HOA reserve funds without a membership vote, itself potentially a breach of fiduciary duty. Terrence sent Crestline a cease and desist letter within 48 hours. He also filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division. He sent Ranata notice that Garrett would be seeking a declaratory judgment in common pleas court to void the lien, along with attorney's fees. Takeaway: if an HOA uses a third-party management company to collect improper fines, the FDCPA may apply, and violations carry $1,000 statutory damages per incident, plus attorney's fees. The lien was withdrawn within a week. Crestline sent a terse one-paragraph letter saying the notice had been issued in error. Ranata said nothing publicly, but privately, and Garrett would only learn this later from Orrin, the third board member, who had quietly become something of an inside source. Ranata was livid. She told Clive that Garrett was a bully with a lawyer, which was genuinely impressive given the circumstances, and that she intended to make Sycamore Ridge uncomfortable for his family. That word, uncomfortable. Orrin repeated it to Garrett over a cup of coffee at Orrin's kitchen table, looking genuinely troubled. "She means it," Orrin said. "She's done this before. The family 2 streets over, the Dunbars. She made their life miserable until they sold." Garrett filed that away. Ranata's escalation came in December, just before the holidays, because petty people have no sense of seasonal timing. The HOA sent formal notice to every household in Sycamore Ridge that the association was considering levying a special assessment, an additional fee charged to all residents, to fund deferred infrastructure improvements. The amount proposed, $800 per household. The necessity cited, repaving and regrading the common area entry road, plus, here it was, remediating improper driveway modifications by unnamed residents. The implication was clear to anyone paying attention. Garrett was somehow costing everyone money. Ranata hadn't named him, but in a cul-de-sac neighborhood, people talked. Garrett started getting looks. A neighbor he'd waved to for 3 years didn't wave back. The isolation tactic. Classic. Garrett handled this with the patience of a man who had learned, slowly, that reacting visibly was exactly what Ranata wanted. He said nothing publicly. He called Orrin. He started drafting a letter to every resident explaining, in simple, factual language with document attachments, exactly what the special assessment was actually for and what it wasn't. He didn't call Ranata names. He just laid out the paper trail, document by document. He handed them out personally on a Saturday morning, walking house to house, knocking on doors, smelling the cold air and someone's wood smoke from a fireplace 2 houses down, the paper slightly damp from the mist. Most people opened the door. Most people read the letter on the spot. More than a few said some variation of, "I wondered what was really going on." The special assessment vote failed at the January meeting. 7 residents showed up to vote no. Ranata had miscalculated her own community. But Garrett could feel the escalation ratcheting upward. Ranata had now failed 3 times. In his experience, in construction, in life, the most dangerous moment with an unreasonable person wasn't when they were winning. It was when they'd lost enough to stop caring about consequences. January and February were quiet, which should have felt like a relief, but mostly felt like pressure building under a closed valve. Garrett used the time well. He'd connected with 3 other Sycamore Ridge residents who'd had their own run-ins with Ranata's board. A retired firefighter named Denton, who'd been fined for a flagpole. A young couple, the Palombos, who'd received a cease and desist over a vegetable garden. And Marvella, a 68-year-old retired nurse who lived 2 houses from Garrett and had been fighting a denied fence application for 11 months. None of them had pushed back hard. Each of them had paper trails. Garrett started collecting them. He also, quietly, methodically, started reviewing the HOA's finances. Under Ohio law, HOA members had the right to inspect financial records upon written request. Garrett submitted a formal request in February for 3 years of bank statements, board meeting minutes, vendor contracts, and reserve fund records. The board had 30 days to comply. They stonewalled. 31 days passed. Garrett filed a complaint with the county court, requesting an order compelling disclosure. Terrence handled the paperwork. The board, apparently realizing they'd tripped another wire, produced a stack of documents the following week. Incomplete, disorganized, some pages photocopied at an angle, as if done in a hurry, and some faint enough that Garrett had to hold them up to the window light to read them. What he found in those records would become important later. He set them aside in his growing folder, behind the lien notices and the bylaw printouts. He labeled that section with a single word, later. March arrived, and Ranata made her most aggressive move yet. On a Sunday evening, while Garrett and Dolores were watching TV, Tess texted from her room. "There are people in our driveway. Not people, a bobcat skid steer and a dump truck." It was 9:47 p.m. By the time Garrett got his boots on and got outside, 3 tons of crushed limestone gravel had been deposited across the full width of his driveway, piled from the street edge back nearly 15 feet, a pale, chunky barrier roughly 2 feet high at its crest, glowing faintly under the streetlight. The smell hit him first, limestone dust and diesel exhaust, sharp and mineral, coating the back of his throat. The truck was already pulling away. The Bobcat operator didn't look at him. There was a notice taped to his mailbox. It said the HOA was exercising its right under the Emergency Aesthetic Authority Amendment to remediate an unlicensed driveway modification. Specifically, that Garrett's driveway had an non-conforming surface approach at the street edge that constituted a hazard to common area pavement. The remediation, gravel barrier pending review. It was, in the bluntest terms, a blockade. Garrett stood in the cold night air and looked at his sealed-in driveway for a long moment. He could hear the creak of a neighbor's door down the street. Someone else had heard the truck. He could feel the gravel dust settling on his skin, gritty and fine. Tess appeared at his shoulder. "Dad." Her voice was quiet. "Go inside," he said, not angry, just certain. He took 12 photographs. He filmed a 2-minute video walking the perimeter of the gravel barrier, narrating what he was seeing, time-stamped on his phone. He called Terrence, who let it go to voicemail but texted back, "I saw the news alert from your security cam. Don't touch the gravel. Don't move it. We're going to need it exactly as it is." Because Garrett had installed a driveway-facing security camera 4 months ago, he had HD footage of the dump truck, the Bobcat, the operator's face, and the license plates of both vehicles. He went back inside. Dolores handed him a coffee without being asked. "What do we do?" she said. Garrett sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. He had 4 things to cross-reference: the vehicle plates, the HOA vendor contracts he'd received in that disorganized document dump, the Ohio statute on unlawful obstruction of a private driveway, and the name of the local TV news station's consumer affairs reporter, a woman named Bev Santoro, who had done a segment 2 years prior on a different HOA abuse case in the county. He found what he was looking for in under 40 minutes. The Bobcat operator worked for a company called Hartwell Property Services, and Hartwell Property Services appeared in the HOA's vendor payment records, specifically a $4,200 payment 2 months prior for landscaping consultation. Ranata had been paying this company with HOA funds for months. Now they were using the company to physically block a resident's driveway. That wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. That was potentially misappropriation of association funds to commit what Ohio law considered interference with property access, a civil tort, and potentially a criminal matter depending on the DA's mood. Garrett closed his laptop and allowed himself one quiet, satisfied exhale. She'd finally done something dumb enough to matter. The next morning, Garrett called the police non-emergency line and reported the driveway blockage. The officer who responded was professionally neutral, took photographs, took Garrett's statement, took a copy of the HOA notice. He said it was a civil matter, but noted it on record. What mattered to Garrett wasn't whether the officer made an arrest. It was the incident report number, paper trail, item 12. Then Garrett made the call he'd been holding in reserve. Orrin, the 3rd board member, the quiet retired teacher who'd voted no on the emergency authority amendment, and had been growing more uncomfortable with every passing month, had been texting Garrett occasionally since the coffee meeting in November. Short messages, links to articles about HOA reform. Once, a photo of Renata's car parked blocking the handicap ramp at the community mailbox cluster. Nothing actionable, just a man who knew something was wrong and hadn't yet found his moment. Garrett called him and asked a direct question. "Is there anything in the HOA records I haven't seen yet that I need to know about?" Orrin was quiet for 7 seconds. Garrett counted. Then Orrin said, "She refinanced the reserve fund." "Here's what that meant," explained plainly. HOA reserve funds are the association's savings account. Money collected from dues specifically to cover future major repairs, like roof replacement on common structures, parking lot resurfacing, that sort of thing. They're not operating funds. They're not the president's discretionary budget. Using them for anything other than their designated purpose requires a full membership vote under Ohio's Planned Community Act. Ranata had not held a vote. What she had done, and what appeared in the financial records Garrett had received, buried in a line item labeled Reserve Reallocation for Operational Efficiency, was transfer $22,000 from the reserve fund into the operating account over a period of 14 months. That money had paid for Crestline Community Services management fees, the Hartwell Property Services consultations, a new exterior sign at the neighborhood entrance, and, Orrin confirmed this from a board meeting he'd attended, a catered board appreciation dinner at a local steakhouse. $22,000, member-funded, spent without authorization. Takeaway: unauthorized use of HOA reserve funds is a breach of fiduciary duty under most state HOA statutes, and in some cases, it meets the threshold for criminal misappropriation. Garrett sat very still when Orrin told him this. Outside his window, the gravel was still piled across his driveway, pale and undisturbed in the morning light. His truck was still trapped, but the whole landscape of the situation had just shifted under his feet. What had started as a neighbor dispute, annoying, exhausting, legally complex, was now something materially different. Ranata hadn't just been abusing her position for personal satisfaction. She'd been using the community's money to fund her campaign against one of the community's own members, potentially against others. The Dunbars who'd sold, the Palombos and their vegetable garden, Denton and his flagpole, all of it funded, at least in part, by money that belonged to every resident of Sycamore Ridge. Garrett called Terrence. Then he called Bev Santoro at the news station. He left a voicemail with his name, number, and one sentence. "I have 3 years of financial records showing an HOA president misappropriating reserve funds to harass individual residents, and I have a driveway full of gravel to prove it." She called back in 40 minutes. The story was about to get much bigger than a driveway. What followed was 5 days of quiet, methodical preparation, the kind of work that doesn't look like much from the outside, but is, in hindsight, the whole game. Garrett's gravel stayed in the driveway. This was deliberate. Every morning he walked out, filmed a 30-second update video, and posted it to a neighborhood Facebook group he'd created 2 weeks prior called Sycamore Ridge Residents, Information Only. By day 3, the group had 94 of the neighborhood's 112 households as members. People were watching. They were angry, and they were paying attention to details they'd previously ignored. The gravel, undisturbed, was evidence. The longer it sat, the angrier the neighborhood got. And Ranata, apparently believing that Garrett would quietly remove it himself or give up, did nothing. This was her critical miscalculation. She'd assumed his patience was surrender. Terrence, meanwhile, was building a multi-track legal strategy that he explained to Garrett on a yellow legal pad one evening at Garrett's kitchen table, with Dolores listening and occasionally asking the clarifying questions Garrett was too proud to ask himself. Track 1. Civil suit against the HOA for unlawful interference with driveway access, seeking compensatory damages for the days Garrett couldn't use his vehicle for work. And Garrett, as a home inspector, had a clear per-day income figure to document. Every day his truck sat trapped was a quantifiable loss. Ohio courts had clear precedent on obstruction of private property access. Terrence had pulled 3 cases. Track 2. A formal complaint to the Ohio Department of Commerce, which licensed HOA management companies like Crestline. If Crestline had facilitated or enabled the improper lien and the blockade without verifying proper procedure, their license was at risk. Complaints created regulatory scrutiny. Regulatory scrutiny made management companies very eager to cooperate. Track 3, and this was the one Garrett found most satisfying, a demand letter to the full HOA membership, sent by certified mail to all 112 households, informing them of the $22,000 reserve fund transfer and formally requesting a special membership meeting to vote on removing the current board under the association's recall provisions. Ohio, HOA law allowed members holding at least 20% of votes to petition for a special meeting. With Orrin already on board and the resident network Garrett had built, getting signatures from 23 households was done in an afternoon. Bev Santoro, the TV reporter, had agreed to attend the special meeting, not to ambush anyone, but because she was already working on a broader segment about HOA financial accountability in the county, and Sycamore Ridge was now the freshest and most visually compelling example she had. She'd asked Garrett if he minded her showing up with a camera crew. He'd said he didn't mind at all. He'd also mentioned, casually, that he planned to have all relevant financial documents organized in a clearly labeled binder, available for anyone who wanted to review them. The physical trap, and yes, there was a physical trap, was Garrett's own idea, drawing on his construction background. He had requested, via certified letter to the board, that since the HOA claimed the gravel was a remediation measure for a driveway hazard, they were therefore responsible for the material's proper disposal under Ohio EPA solid waste guidelines. He cited the specific regulation number. He included a quote from a licensed waste removal company. $1,800 for 3 tons of crushed limestone, including transport and tipping fees. He gave the board 48 hours to either remove the gravel themselves, at HOA expense, or formally acknowledge in writing that the material had been placed illegally, in which case he would remove it and bill them for reimbursement, plus his documented work loss damages. The beauty of this was simple. If they removed it, they were paying to clean up their own mess, and implicitly conceding the blockade was unjustified. If they didn't, he'd let it sit through the special membership meeting, on camera, visible, 3 tons of physical evidence of what the board had done with community money and authority. He'd also quietly spoken with Denton, the Palombos, Marvella, and 4 other residents who'd been targeted by the board. They had documentation. They were willing to speak at the meeting. He'd coached them gently. Bring your documents, tell your facts, stay calm, let the paper trail do the emotion for you. The night before the meeting, Garrett sat at his kitchen table and went through the binder one last time. The smell of coffee, the tick of the kitchen clock, the faint crunch from outside when the wind shifted some of the gravel against his truck's front tire. Tess came in and asked if he needed anything. "No," he said, "I think we're ready." She gave him a look that reminded him she was 16 and had inherited Dolores's ability to read a room. "You're kind of enjoying this," she said. He didn't deny it. 3 days before the special meeting, Ranata made her move. Or rather, her series of moves, arriving in rapid succession like someone who'd finally recognized the clock was running out. The first was a letter from an attorney. Not a real litigation thread. Terrence read it in under 5 minutes and pronounced it a scarecrow, but an official-looking document accusing Garrett of harassment, defamation, and tortious interference with HOA governance via the Facebook group. The letter demanded he take the group down and cease all communication with residents about pending board matters. The attorney was a solo practitioner from a suburb 40 miles away, whose website looked like it hadn't been updated since 2009. Garrett and Terrence sent a 2-paragraph response citing First Amendment protections for homeowner speech about a matter of community governance, noting that the group contained only documented facts and public records, and inviting the attorney to proceed to litigation if he disagreed. They never heard from him again. The second move was more personal. Ranata went to 3 households on Fenwick Court, the closest neighbors, and told them, privately, that Garrett was planning to convert his property into a commercial inspection business, with client vehicles parking on the street daily, which would devastate property values. This was fabricated entirely. Garrett ran his business from his truck. Clients never came to his home. He found out about it because one of those neighbors, a woman named Phyllis, who'd lived across the street from Garrett for 9 years, and whose husband Garrett had helped after a tree fell on their fence, called Dolores directly to say, "I don't believe a word of it, but I thought you should know she's saying it." Dolores told Garrett. Garrett added it to the binder under a new tab labeled Defamation, Preserve. The third move was the one that drew blood, because it targeted Tess. Ranata submitted a formal complaint to the county recreation department, claiming that the Howell family's property had an unlicensed sports training facility, meaning the basketball hoop, the same one Garrett had moved 6 inches 18 months ago. She alleged it was being used for private coaching sessions for compensation. Tess was a soccer player, not a basketball player, and the hoop hadn't been touched in months. But the complaint triggered an automatic inquiry letter from the county, which arrived on a Tuesday, and which Tess intercepted from the mailbox and read before her parents saw it. She was quiet at dinner. Garrett eventually asked what was wrong. She showed him the letter. "Is she going to make me lose my scholarship chances?" Tess asked. Her voice was controlled, but her jaw was tight in the exact way Dolores's jaw got tight before she got very precise and terrifying. Garrett looked at his daughter and felt something he hadn't felt in this whole process. Pure, clear anger. Not the cold, strategic kind he'd been using, the hot kind. He took one breath, let it out, and put the letter in the binder. "No," he said, "she's not." The county inquiry was dismissed within a week after Garrett provided photographs, a written statement, and a note from Tess's soccer coach confirming her training schedule. But the damage to Ranata's credibility was accumulating, because when Garrett shared the inquiry letter, with Tess's details redacted, in the Facebook group as an example of what the board had been doing to residents, the response was swift and visceral. 23 comments in 2 hours. Even residents who'd been neutral were now angry. Orrin, watching from his inside position, texted Garrett. She knows she's losing. She's panicking. Ranata's fourth and final pre-meeting move was to call an emergency board session, just herself and Clive, since Orrin refused to attend, and gave Garrett a heads up it was happening. At that session, she and Clive voted to amend the recall provisions in the bylaws to require a 60% membership supermajority instead of the simple majority the existing bylaws specified. There was one problem. You cannot amend bylaws through a board resolution. Bylaw amendments in an Ohio planned community required a full membership vote. Ranata, apparently rattled enough to stop reading her own documents carefully, had just passed an invalid amendment and created a paper record of an improper board meeting. It was the equivalent of a chess player tipping over their own king while trying to castle. Terrence nearly laughed when Garrett forwarded him the meeting minutes. "She's doing our work for us," he texted back. The special meeting was in 2 days. The gravel was still in the driveway. Bev Santoro had confirmed she'd be there with a camera. Garrett had a binder, 7 resident witnesses, a lawsuit ready to file, and a reporter. And Ranata had a panicked invalid bylaw amendment and a borrowed attorney who'd already gone quiet. The day before the meeting, Garrett did almost nothing. This was the hardest part. He took Dolores to lunch. He watched Tess's soccer practice in the afternoon, standing at the edge of the field in his jacket, hands in his pockets, watching her move. Quick, precise, utterly absorbed in something that had nothing to do with HOA politics. A coach was there from a Division II program in the area, clipboard in hand, watching Tess with the focused attention of someone doing math in their head. Good math. Garrett drove home feeling something close to peace, which he recognized as potentially dangerous, because the moment before something goes right is exactly when you start making mistakes. He reviewed the binder once more that evening. He called Terrence, who told him everything was in order. He called Orrin, who confirmed the meeting would be held at the community clubhouse, an HOA-owned facility, meaning Ranata couldn't lock it without creating another legal problem, and that at least 30 households had confirmed attendance. Then, at 11:15 p.m., his phone buzzed. It was a neighbor 3 doors down, a man named Wycliffe, who drove a night shift delivery route and had been among the most vocal supporters in the Facebook group. His message? Someone just pulled up to your driveway, didn't get out, sat there for a few minutes, left, couldn't see the plate, heads up. Garrett checked his driveway camera. Clear footage, a gray SUV, partial plate visible, 2 letters and a number, had idled at the foot of his driveway for 3.5 minutes around 11 p.m., then pulled away. He couldn't identify the driver. He saved the clip, texted Terrence the file, and filed a non-emergency police report. Not because he expected action, but because the incident report number would exist. He slept 5 hours. Clean. What was happening simultaneously, and what Garrett wouldn't fully learn until later, was that Ranata was on the phone until nearly 2 a.m., trying to find a way to cancel the meeting. She called the HOA's insurance company, apparently hoping they'd intervene. She called Crestline, whose representative told her flatly that they couldn't cancel a member petition special meeting without liability exposure, and that their company's legal counsel had already advised them to cooperate with any ongoing investigations. She called Clive, who sounded, according to Orrin's later account, like a man who was beginning to understand the ship was sinking and was calculating whether it was too late to swim. Wanda, the tennis partner, the third board vote, had gone silent 3 days ago. She hadn't responded to board emails. She hadn't appeared at Renata's invalid emergency session. She was, in the language of disasters, decoupling. Morning of the meeting. Cold, clear day in late March. The kind where the light is sharp and everything looks more defined than usual. Garrett walked his driveway one more time, filming the gravel, still exactly where it had been placed 22 days prior. Limestone dust on the asphalt surface, pale against the dark. He posted the video with a simple caption, Day 22, meeting tonight at 7, see you there. 89 people liked it within an hour. He spent the morning organizing his materials, the binder with tabs for financial records, violation history, the wrongful lien documentation, the reserve fund analysis, the vendor payment trail, and the collected statements from Denton, the Palombos, Marvella, and 4 others. He printed 12 copies, one for Terrence, one for Bev Santoro, one for Orrin, and the rest for any resident who wanted them. He called each of his 7 witnesses and gave them a simple instruction. Say what happened to you. Use dates and documents. Don't editorialize. Let the facts be the drama. By 5 p.m., Terrence had confirmed the civil lawsuit paperwork was drafted and ready to file the following morning, if the board did not agree, at the meeting, to remove the gravel at HOA expense and enter mediation. By 6 p.m., Bev Santoro and her camera operator were parked 2 blocks away, waiting for Garrett's text to approach. By 6:45, the community clubhouse parking lot was full. People were standing outside, neighbors talking in low voices, breath visible in the cold air. Garrett had not seen this many Sycamore Ridge residents gathered in one place in 3 years. He recognized most of them. He nodded. They nodded back. Renata's car was already there when he arrived, parked at an angle in the lot, as if she'd been in a hurry. He could see light in the clubhouse windows. He could hear voices. He texted Bev. Now. He walked in. The Sycamore Ridge Community Clubhouse was a beige, carpeted rectangle with folding chairs and fluorescent lights, and a podium that had seen better decades. On any other night, it was the setting for budget reviews and holiday party planning. Tonight, it held 64 residents sitting down, and at least 15 more standing along the walls. The folding chairs were filled front to back. The air smelled of coffee from a percolator someone had thought to bring, and something like nervous energy, the particular charge of a room where people have been waiting a long time to say something. Garrett entered from the back. Terrence was already seated in the front row, briefcase at his feet. A man so professionally calm, he might have been waiting for a bus. Orrin was at the table designated for board members, sitting alone on one end, looking relieved to see Garrett. Ranata was at the other end of the same table, between Clive and, surprisingly, Wanda, who had shown up after all, but who was staring at the tabletop with the focused attention of someone who had made a decision and was still waiting to act on it. Bev Santoro and her camera operator came in through the side door 30 seconds after Garrett. Ranata saw them. Her face went through several expressions in rapid succession, landing on controlled fury. The meeting was called to order by Orrin, the only board member who could do so without a conflict of interest, and he immediately recognized Garrett to present the petition for the special agenda items. Garrett stood. He placed his binder on the podium. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not use a single word like outrageous or corrupt or unbelievable. He didn't need to. He read dates, dollar amounts, document reference numbers, and statute citations. He described the gravel installation with the same flat, factual tone he used to describe a cracked foundation joist on a home inspection report. He referenced the Hartwell payment records, $4,200, then $2,100, then the gravel delivery billed at $3,600, all from HOA operating funds, supplemented by improperly transferred reserve funds. He held up a photograph of his driveway, taken that morning. The room was completely silent. Then he turned the floor over to his neighbors. Denton spoke for 3 minutes about his flagpole. Marvella spoke for 4 minutes about her fence application, her voice measured and clear. And when she mentioned she'd been told the fence was inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics, while a board member's privacy screen remained in place unapproved, several people in the audience made sounds of recognition. The Palombos presented their cease and desist over a vegetable garden. Then 3 more residents spoke, quietly, factually, with documents in hand. By the time the 7th neighbor finished, the temperature in the room had changed. Not angry, exactly. Past angry. Something more serious. Comprehension. Ranata asked to speak. Orrin gave her the floor. She stood and began with a prepared statement about maintaining community standards and protecting property values, and she got approximately 90 seconds in before Wanda, seated 18 inches to her right, said, clearly and without drama, "Ranata, I'm resigning from the board effective tonight, and I'm asking you to do the same." The room exhaled. Ranata stared at Wanda. Wanda looked at the table. Bev Santoro's camera was rolling. Clive said nothing. He was studying his shoes with the devotion of a man who had concluded, correctly, that his best remaining option was furniture-level invisibility. Terrence stood and formally presented the demand. Remove the gravel from Garrett Howell's driveway at HOA expense within 48 hours. Halt all pending violations and assessments against Garrett Howell and the 6 other residents named in the petition. Commission an independent audit of the HOA's financials from the past 3 years. And hold new board elections within 60 days. Failure on any point would result in the civil lawsuit being filed the following morning. The vote was called. Orrin voted yes to all items. Wanda, having resigned, abstained but nodded. Clive, after a pause so long it felt theatrical, voted yes. Ranata voted no. The motion carried 2-1. Ranata was the one. She gathered her papers. She walked out without speaking. The room watched her go, and there was no cheering, just a long, quiet exhale, like a building settling after a storm. Garrett stood at the podium for a moment and looked at 64 people who lived within a quarter-mile of his house. "Thank you," he said. "That's it. That's all I've got." Outside, the gravel was still in his driveway, but it wouldn't be for long. They'd told him so in writing, in a room full of witnesses, on camera. The next morning, Hartwell Property Services arrived at 8 a.m. and removed every last stone. The gravel was gone by 10:15 a.m. Garrett filmed the clean driveway. He posted the video to the Facebook group with a single line, "Done." It got 204 reactions, which, for a neighborhood of 112 households, is what mathematicians would call statistically remarkable, and what everyone else would call People were sharing it. Bev Santoro's segment aired that Friday evening on the local news. It ran 6.5 minutes, long for a local broadcast, and it was calm, accurate, and devastating. The financial figures, the vendor connections, the driveway footage, Marvella talking about her fence, Garrett explaining the reserve fund misappropriation in language so clear and plain that it needed no narration over it. Ranata was offered comment. She declined. The Ohio Attorney General's office, which had received Terrence's complaint about Crestline 4 months prior, contacted Garrett 2 weeks after the broadcast to inform him that the complaint had been upgraded to a formal investigation. Crestline Community Services voluntarily terminated their contract with Sycamore Ridge before the investigation concluded. Their license was placed under review. The independent audit commissioned by the new board, elected 60 days after the special meeting, with Orrin keeping his seat and 2 new members from the community including Marvella, found $27,400 in total reserve fund expenditures without proper authorization. The new board filed a demand letter against Ranata personally for restitution. Her attorney, a different one, this time from a real firm, negotiated a settlement in which she repaid $19,000 and resigned all HOA affiliations permanently. Clive resigned before the elections. Wanda cooperated fully with the audit and was not named in the demand. Garrett's civil lawsuit was settled out of court 4 months later. The HOA, under new management, agreed to pay $8,400 in documented work loss damages for the 22 days his truck was blocked, plus $3,200 in attorney's fees. He used part of the settlement to finally build the workshop he'd originally applied for. The county permit had been approved within a week of the new board taking over and issuing a blanket withdrawal of all previously improper denial letters. He built the workshop over 3 weekends. Denton came over and helped on the framing. Garrett's back held up better than he'd expected, mostly because he'd designed the thing to not require bending if he could help it. It smelled like sawdust and treated lumber, and the particular satisfaction of a project with a long backstory finally getting built. He hung a coffee maker on the wall before he'd even installed the shelving. Tess got a partial athletic scholarship. Division II, women's soccer, a solid program 2 states over. The college coach who'd been at her practice that afternoon had called a week after the meeting. The 2 events were unrelated, except that for Garrett, they existed in the same emotional space. Good things happening, finally, without resistance. The Sycamore Ridge HOA, under new leadership, redirected $6,000 of reserves, with proper member authorization, into a neighborhood improvement fund. Their first project, a small scholarship fund for graduating Sycamore Ridge seniors pursuing technical training or skilled trades programs, named after no one in particular and open to any resident's child. Marvella proposed it at the first new board meeting. It passed unanimously. The second project was a neighborhood block party, first one the community had held in over 4 years. It happened in late July. Someone brought a grill. Someone else brought a sound system. The smell of charcoal and cut grass and sunscreen was the best thing that had happened on Fenwick Court in a very long time. Garrett stood in his driveway, clean, unobstructed, the concrete warm under his boots, and watched his neighbors talk to each other, and thought that this was what a neighborhood was actually supposed to be. Renata Foss reportedly moved to a condominium development 12 miles away. Whether she joined their HOA board is, at this time, unknown.
You know what I keep coming back to? That hardware truck showing up at 8 a.m. Not Garrett's truck, their truck. The same company Ranata had been playing with neighborhood money for months, pulling up to his driveway, loading 3 tons of limestone back into their bed, on her dime. She had the title, The Vault, a property management company on speed dial. She had every structural advantage a neighborhood association can have over one single homeowner, and she still lost. Not because Garrett got lucky, not because he had connections or money or a team behind him, because he understood something she didn't count on. The same rulebook she was using to come after him was the exact rulebook he could use to take her smart. That same rulebook she was using to come after him was the exact rulebook she could use to take her apart. She handed him the weapon. He just learned how to hold it. If you woke up tomorrow and found your driveway blocked by people who were supposed to be protecting your neighborhood, what's the first thing you do? Most people explode or go quiet. Ranata was counting on both. Drop your answer in the comments. I read those. If this one felt familiar, share it. Someone in your feed is fighting their own version of this right now. Maybe not gravel, but something. Subscribe if you want more. Gravel's gone, check clear. Garrett's workshop finally got built.